So my name is Sue Falkingham. I'm an audiologist with about 30 years of experience. I know I don't look it, but I do have a real interest in helping people to understand the connection with better hearing and better health. And we've learned a lot over the last 30 years about those connections. And I'm sure it will be quite a surprise to some of you on this call that so many of these diseases and conditions can have an effect on our hearing, or we know that people who have a hearing loss can have more risk of some of these particular conditions as well. So getting our hearing checked and making it part of our everyday and regular healthcare appointments is something that's really important throughout our lifespan. So if you've got a friend or a family member that's never had their hearing checked, then it really is something you should ask them about and ask them yourselves about them getting a routine check. We shouldn't just leave it until we feel there's a problem with our hearing, because it can be the first sign for some of these diseases in particular. So we know that if we detect a low frequency hearing loss, for example, this might put people at more risk of a cardiovascular event, so some sort of heart attack or stroke. And we know that we should check these things and ask people to go to their GP. We know that people with things like hypertension, where their blood pressure is high, can accelerate hearing loss in those individuals. And we also know that people with diabetes are much more likely to have hearing loss than people without diabetes there as well. So lots of conditions that we're able to now show with lots of research are connected to our hearing health and better hearing health. But we also see a lot of headlines, and we've seen quite a few over the last few months, haven't we? I'm sure some of you have seen headlines in the newspapers about being able to tackle some of our worries around cognitive decline, dementia, and Alzheimer's by improving our hearing. We know that the ears act as the gateway to the computer that is our brain, and that computer needs input. And it needs conversation, it needs interaction. And we know that by improving our hearing and keeping our hearing status good throughout our lives, we can improve our ability to take information in. And actually, we are starting to be able to see a real change in people's cognitive ability as they get older, associated with good hearing and with using hearing instruments. We always want to encourage people to use hearing aids, but a couple of things that have become much more prevalent over the last 12 months have been around isolation and loneliness. Isolation and loneliness have become very hot topics around the pandemic. And of course, it's something that our government have been working really hard on through the pandemic to get information out to people about ways that they might tackle the isolation that social distancing and lockdowns have caused. So I wanted to talk a little bit about loneliness today. I don't want this to be a depressing conversation, because we are starting to come out at the other end. But of course, loneliness isn't new, and loneliness has been linked quite strongly with hearing loss. This is a research centre in the US, and it's called Johns Hopkins. The researcher is Frank Lin. He's a very well-known researcher with older people, but also around cognitive health and our brain function. And he talks about hearing loss being linked to loneliness, because what we lose when we lose our hearing is that ability to communicate. We lose that ability to freely communicate and not have to think about the conversation. And obviously, getting a hearing instrument can really help us there, but it isn't a replacement for your actual ears. So there is always the worry that our communication suffers if we're not hearing well. What we tend to find is that people wait a long time to come forwards and talk to us about their hearing. So as a profession, it can be between 7 and 10 years but after somebody first notices their hearing loss, that they actually turn up at our door. And we do lots of things to try and encourage people to come and get their hearing checked throughout life. But it isn't like our eyes and our teeth, where we are sort of taught at school to get those regular checks. So by the time we see people, they've often started to just walk away a little bit from some of their social situations. So they might go to the pub a bit less often. They might have found themselves leaving groups because they've decided that they weren't getting much out of them because they couldn't hear as well as they should. They might even have been a little embarrassed in some circumstances because they didn't hear properly. So we do find that that communication loss leads to social isolation. And we know in both the hearing loss population, but also people generally, that the more isolated we are, the higher the risk of depression and of depressive illness being identified. And of course, that then leads to loneliness. And loneliness is in that cycle with our hearing loss, but also with that social isolation. There's a real neurobiology of why loneliness is such a health crisis. And this is really interesting reading. What we find is that the neurobiology relates to our fight or flight mechanism. So I'm sure lots of you have heard about fight or flight. This is the stuff that kept us safe when we were living in much more dangerous times. So if a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger was coming to get the caveman, then his body would get him ready to attack or to run away. And that whole system is around our sympathetic nervous system and the release of a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol does all sorts of interesting things in our body. So, for instance, it makes our blood stickier and more likely to clot. That's fabulous when you've got a tiger coming at you, because if he scratches you, you want your blood to clot really fast, and you want it to be stickier so that you don't bleed heavily. It's cortisol will also increase the amount of glucose in our body, so that we have more energy to run away or to fight. All fabulous things back then. Unfortunately, if the threat doesn't go away, the cortisol continues to act around the body. So we don't release the hormone that gets rid of the cortisol. And loneliness is perceived by our body as a threat. And that constant threat leads to a constant level of cortisol that's increased, and that can lead to a number of other conditions that we're looking at in the previous slides. So, for instance, the stroke and heart disease is around that extra clotting factor and the stickier blood. The diabetes is around having extra glucose in the body, getting ready to fight or to flight. So you can see that loneliness can feed into some very physical as well as mental states of health. And the UK have been tackling loneliness for quite a long time now. So pre-pandemic, we were the only country in the world with a Minister for Loneliness. And this is Baroness Barron, who is the current Minister for Loneliness. And it was identified as a health crisis in this country. And it was built, a lot of strategy was built after the Jo Cox incident where the MP was killed. There was a lot of government strategy because this was one of her things. It was a thing of hers about we've got more that joins us together than that divides us. And she was very much a champion of looking at loneliness as a social crisis. So there's been a policy there for a number of years, and GPs are encouraged to have conversations and something called social prescribing, which allows GPs, rather than prescribing antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications, to actually define loneliness as something that needs activity and companionship. And they can actually prescribe things like joining clubs, gym memberships, things like that. And social prescribing is a really helpful and cost-effective way of improving people's health, both physically and mentally, because we're reducing their loneliness. There's been a campaign through the pandemic that is Let's Talk Loneliness, and you've seen a lot from celebrities, but also particularly the royal family getting involved in this one, where they've been doing phone calls around people who have been asked to shield. They've been talking to people who have been isolated, and they've also been talking to family groups and to people who are trying to help people who are isolated to build that community spirit that we needed to get us through those long periods of isolation and lockdown. But remember that we all have a little part to play, don't we? And I'm sure some of you have volunteered on some of the local community projects and have perhaps volunteered to be a befriender virtually as well. So if you have experienced loneliness and you want to talk to somebody, then there are lots of government resources on that Let's Talk Loneliness helpline. And as I say, I hope that I've tied those two things together in terms of hearing as well, and how important it is for us to have those conversations about our hearing so that we don't ever get into the position where we start to isolate ourselves. So why do we think that you will you'll age better if you have better hearing? Well, there are 4 ways. The first one is that sociable aspect. So we've talked about how important it is to be engaged. I, for one, am really excited about the last week or so where we've been able to actually see family and friends and travel again a little bit. And it's absolutely vital to everybody's well-being, but also obviously when you get there you want to be engaged and you want to maintain those connections. And research shows that people who enjoy social relationships are more likely to live longer. For those of you that have got online happily today, I'm going to direct you to a TED talk, and you'll find it TED.com. And if you put in the Harvard longevity study, you'll find a fabulous 20-minute video about this. They looked at a group of, it started off with them being young men who were new students at Harvard in about the 1920s. And they have followed them throughout their life. And they've now got gentlemen in their 80s, and they've also added women to the mix as Harvard took in women, but they have just continued to follow them and follow them. And what you'll find from that Harvard study is that those with really good social connections, so friends, family, relationships, have actually lived longer than those without those relationships. So it's really interesting to listen to them talk about that particular research. You don't get many research studies that have been going on for that length of time. So hearing your best also keeps you alert and in control. It's a really important thing around our confidence, isn't it? And I'm sure those of you that have been fitted with hearing instruments will know that the improvement in just being able to be connected to your world around you, things like hearing the bird song, understanding when somebody says, oh, can you hear that? And you think, oh, yeah, right, such and such. Just that ability to stay connected is really important. But we actually do know that people are less likely to get accidental injuries and less likely to fall if they have good hearing. And then there's the mentally sharp. So we're encouraged, aren't we, to keep our brain active, to do crosswords, to do Sudoku. I'm absolutely hopeless at Sudoku. I don't know about the rest of you. But gamification and getting involved in all of these things and keeping our brain active doing those brain training games has been positively encouraged. But we've got to make sure that we also get the signal in from our ears to our brain. And there was a Lancet Commission study that looked at this particular aspect of what are the things we can do to reduce our risk of cognitive decline, because it's not one thing. So dementia is actually a really interesting statement, and cognitive decline's really interesting because lots of different little factors are changing to improve our general mental health. So things like an improvement in diet over the last 20 and 30 years for the general population, as well as our belief that we should now do physical exercise, are actually reducing people's risk of dementia as well as improving their physical health. So the Lancet report looked at all sorts of different little things we can do to improve and to reduce our risk of developing cognitive problems in later life. And many of them start right from when we become adults. So again, something that shows that hearing loss in midlife, so in our 40s and 50s, is a real risk factor for that cognitive decline. Untreated hearing loss, I might add. And of course, the one thing we all want is to be able to connect, to be engaged, and to enjoy the world around us. So we do believe that Hearing Your Best will bring real benefits to you in your general everyday life, and positive outlook as well. So our motto at Starkey has always been hear better, live better. And we truly believe that that is one of the things that you can do for yourself. And I want to encourage you to do this for your friends and family too, which is to keep a check on your hearing throughout life and to keep going forwards and getting tested.